Here we are for another round of the 70s versus the 90s, and it's a psycho showdown when I put Don Siegel's Dirty Harry against David Fincher's Seven. And man, was this a wild one to get through. Another hard one because both of these movies are really exceptional. So let's just dive right on into the first one. We have Don Siegel's Dirty Harry, which is one of the most iconic fucking films of all time, especially characters like the Inspector Dirty Harry Callahan, played brilliantly by Clint Eastwood, who would also play him in four other movies, and similar personas that he created with this, much like the Man with No Name, Dirty Harry became like his other persona and stuff. But the film itself is loosely based off of the Zodiac killer of the time, and that character Scorpio is what's based off of that thing, and of course played very creepily by Andy Robinson. He played that part so well that he couldn't get work for a good decade after this movie. But of course the film centers around the title character who's hunting a serial killer in San Francisco, and that has one of the greatest openings of any film that I've seen. That whole when you see that rooftop view from the killer's point of view, and with the rooftop swimming pool, and then he kills the girl, and then it cuts to the fucking opening credits where it basically announces Clint Eastwood as Dirty Harry in the film, and we see through that opening credits sequence with brilliant music by Lalo Schifrin, one of the greatest musical composers for film, of course, most notable for doing the Mission Impossible theme, as well as the theme for Bullet. And of course he also adds a kind of a lavish score to this, but also make it kind of accentuating the creepiness and the uneasiness of what's going on in the film. But through that opening credit sequence, we see Dirty Harry played very iconically by Clint Eastwood, and we see that this man knows his shit. He may not necessarily like his job, but he's good at his job. We see him basically being a detective, what he's supposed to be. And even that scene, I mean, man's just going for a hot dog, he ends up thwarting a bank robbery. One of the most brilliant scenes, because Don Siegel was a great action director. Of course, he came up editing movies in Warner Brothers, and then basically made a name for himself in film noir, and one very great science fiction picture, in Invasion of the Body Snatchers. But he's really good at building tension, and that sequence is proof of that. And just even when the Scorpio character has Clint Eastwood running around with the bag of money, going from phone booth to phone booth, that is some chilling shit, and especially the music by Lalo Schifrin especially accentuates that. And the film itself is pretty solid, really good script, great character, and the supporting characters are there to do whatever they need to do, and then for as racist as Dirty Harry is, or maybe even fascistic the way some people probably consider him, he's really not as big of an asshole as you would think. The actions kind of speak louder than words, but he really is, he's dedicated to the rule of law, and he wants to see, good prevail. He's still got that, little bit of optimism in it. But, the movie itself kind of proves, because whereas like the Scorpio characters based off of the Zodiac killer, they never, to this day, I believe, still haven't actually caught the real Zodiac killer. And so this movie sheds a little more optimism on the fact that all you really need is a big fucking gun to take down a serial killer. And, and really there's no rhyme or reason to what he did. Really just money. That's what he wants. And I suppose there's a bigger social commentary on that, but it's really, it seems to be just to fuck with the police type thing. And, maybe this motherfucker just likes to kill, as Dirty Harry mentions in the film. And, there's a lot of, most of your social commentary from this does come from like, the character Dirty Harry just bitching about, all the scum of the world, and, all the bullshit red tape that he's got to go through, And so then we move forward to David Fincher's Seven, which is another serial killer police procedural. Only this time we have Morgan Freeman and Brad Pitt Of course, the partner in Dirty Harry was not like a big name star. He's kind of a character actor, a cultural, um, every partner that he had was some cultural minority or something to like really like pin down how much of a male chauvinist pig racist he was type thing, but then also coming around to him. Whereas like the beautiful thing about Seven is it doesn't play on any of that. They're both, detectives in the same profession, even though it's a black man and a white man. Like race really isn't discussed in the movie. Everything's just kind of more just society's just shit in general. There's very few movies that Dirty Harry talks about how shitty society is, but it doesn't really just capture the bleakness that Seven does. There's only been a few others like Death Wish and fucking Taxi Driver that really nail just how disgusting society is and how bad it's become. The only difference is there's no fucking like catharsis basically, or no good catharsis in the sense that the kind of pleasurable catharsis that we got in 70s films like that. But here we have a serial killer that's killing people based off of the seven deadly sins in the Bible, and doling out his own form of attrition for these sinners, so to speak. And the film is brilliantly written by like Andrew Kevin Walker, and brilliantly directed by Fincher. Everybody's great in their respective parts. Because Morgan Freeman, it's every like cop trope that you see in movies. The guy, the detective that's at the end of his rope, and he's like a week from retirement, and you got the young hotshot cop that still very naive. He thinks he can change the world with a gun and a badge type thing. And both Morgan Freeman and Brad Pitt play their parts to the hilt. And it's got a great supporting cast of equally cynical motherfuckers. Like Arlie Ermey is their police captain, and you got Richard Roundtree as the district attorney. But the beautiful thing is the way they don't never tell you who the serial killer is. Like Kevin Spacey is not in the opening credits, but Kevin Spacey plays John Doe, the serial killer, who basically just he has all this shit planned, and when it all comes to light, that is one of the most devastating endings that I've ever seen in a film. Here's the thing. Seven has a pretty weak opening. It definitely establishes their characters similar to the way that they established in Dirty Harry. It just doesn't have that oomph to it. It does kind of have that creepy vibe. And I'll say this, the music isn't as good in Seven, but like this is, like I said, this is a very close one. So I got to get real nitpicky on this one. So this is where the nit meets the picky. And so the thing about it is that ending is way more powerful than fucking Dirty Harry. Because think about that ending, when it all comes around, he basically turns himself into a martyr, and it all fits into his grand scheme because he was the envious one. He died, he has Brad Pitt become Wrath to fucking get rid of his envy and shit, and just fucking insane shit. And much in the way where like Dirty Harry set the tone for like the fucking sleazy, just ramshackle serial killers that would kind of be in a bunch of other like either Clint Eastwood movies or Charles Bronson movies or any kind of cheap, low budget thrill kill movie of the 80s. They're the same way that Seven set the tone for like every methodical, cold calculating serial killer that has some grandmaster plan because he's a fucking genius type shit. So they were definitely trendsetters in their own right, and it was at the time they came out. But it's the script is solid. There's honestly zero complaints because the ending of Dirty Harry is pretty fucking lame. It's a fucking ripoff of High Noon where he throws the bat. He kills the guy, does that speech, the great speech that was ghost written by John Milius. And he fucking delivers that speech, a different way than he does at the beginning, where he's kind of fucking with the bank robber. But once he's spent all his time. I mean, the dude fucking hijacks a busload of kids, and he's already killed a bunch of other people. They're mostly kids and women and shit. And so like Dirty Harry's just had enough. He just fucking delivers his speech through gritted teeth and just shoots him. And that's badass in and of itself, but it's still like very optimistic that you can actually get rid of evil by just a really big fucking gun, the most powerful handgun in the world, as he calls it and shit, and then throws the badge in the river, just like, Gary Cooper stomps on his in High Noon. But that ending would be a lot more poignant and profound had they not made 4 sequels to this fucking movie. But I guess the time that it came out, it was powerful. But the thing about 7 is there's no sequels. I mean, you probably could come up with some contrived bullshit, but that ending is just like, throughout cinema, there's been very few endings that just fucking jar you like that, and just, kind of, and even Morgan Freeman, can't even find optimism in that shit. It's like I said, it's that old Hemingway quote: "The world is a beautiful place and worth fighting for." I agree with the second part. I mean, that shit is just, even when you can't even consider the world as even nice and beautiful, but you're still willing to fight for it, that's some fucking bleak shit. So this round's clearly got to go to the 90s. 7 crushes Dirty Harry when it comes to that ending. It may not be as iconic as Dirty Harry, but this isn't a fucking contest of what's more iconic. The contest is what is the better movie, and I believe 7 is the better movie, especially for that ending, and what a script. So for anybody keeping score, that's 45-39. The 70s are only up by 6 now, but that lead is closing it, every time. The 90s keep coming back and coming back. And, so who knows what's going to happen. Like I said, Don Siegel and David Fincher, both great directors, but Fincher made the better movie this round, And like I said, if I've said anything wrong, anything you disagree with, feel free to eviscerate me in the comments. Like I said, this is a rough draft for a doctoral thesis. It's turned into a scientific obsession. It's all open for debate. Change my mind, I don't care, but I'm pretty well set. 45-39. 70's only up by 6. Next week's main event, Kelly's Heroes versus Three Kings. So should be exciting.